Hey there, it's Daniel Priestley, and I'm absolutely thrilled to be interviewing someone today who I'm just can't wait to introduce you to. It's James Thornton, the founder of CLIENTEARTH. CLIENTEARTH is a law firm that protects the planet, and recently I've been completely geeking out on the book CLIENTEARTH. I've been reading the stories. It reads like a John Grisham novel with the most incredible stories, stuff that makes your head spin that it even goes on in the world. And suddenly I feel so grateful that James and his team are in the world doing something about this. I've got a completely new respect for the law. I've got a completely new respect for what's possible and how much transformation can happen in a short space of time. And honestly, it is just my absolute pleasure and privilege to be having this conversation. Thank you so much for joining us on the Dent podcast.
Well, thank you, Daniel. It's such a pleasure to be here. And there are many stories. There are many things. Where would you like to go?
Let's go to two despicable stories that are in the early starting point of the book. So the first despicable, just horrendous story that is in the book is there's this bad guy called Luther. Luther is a pig farmer and slaughterhouse owner who's dumping waste into a river, and like a horrendous waste. Yep. And he's this kind of third generation wealthy kind of polluter, Luther the polluter, and you as a young lawyer decide to kind of cunningly sneak up and use the law to stop this, and it's just such a cool story. This is one of your first cases, right?
It is absolutely one of my first cases. I was 20 something at the time, and I set out. This was in the U.S. during the Reagan Administration, when Ronald Reagan decided to stop enforcing the laws. And they told the polluters, don't worry, we're not going to enforce the laws. So people like this.
And they created this loophole where they kind of said, well, we're going to create citizen law. So if any citizen has a problem with it, well, they can bring a court case against you type thing, which kind of was, everyone was thinking, oh, well, no one's going to actually do that. And then you show up.
Well, the amazing thing is, yes, so you could, the way the law worked, and by the way, I've recently gotten the Chinese to have the same system. It's another story. But so you in the U.S. can bring a citizen case and act like the Attorney General against a polluting company. So I showed up, and this was the biggest pig slaughterhouse in the USA. It was in Virginia. And I arrived to go visit. You send a letter saying, I'm going to sue you left, right, and center in 60 days unless you do what I want and pay penalties for it. And they invited me to a meeting. So I drove in, I rented a car, drove in. It was 100 degrees, and you could smell the place from miles and miles away. They slaughtered thousands and thousands of pigs.
In the book, you describe it as almost knocking you back into your chair. When you tried to hop out of the car, and then the overwhelming stench of the place just knocked you back into the car type thing.
Absolutely. Well, and then I went in to meet Mr. Luther, who was the head of this company, Smithfield. And I was put, in a waiting room, and I thought, well, what does Mr. Luther read? And it was there were many issues of Industrial Meat Magazine, so that you begin to get clues, the smell, the Industrial Meat Magazine, and then
he's someone who's found his passion in life. And I mean, in the movies, you think of bad guys, and you think these guys couldn't possibly exist, but Luther sounds like a proper baddie.
Luther was a very strong character. So you go into his office, huge office, big man, must eat quite a lot of his products. And on his desk, there's a sign with his nickname. His nickname is Big Ham. Okay, on his desk it's like porn. There are all of these little statues of pigs.
So strange.
Very strange. And then, so Mr. Luther is sitting behind his desk, and to his right, in a rocking chair, now we're in Virginia, there really was in a rocking chair, is his lawyer, and he introduces his lawyer, and he says, this is my lawyer, Woody Crook. So it's Mr. Luther and Mr. Crook. I kid you not. And then Mr. Luther says, boy, this was the South, and I was 20-something.
And you were 20-something, so he, boy,
what do you want? And I said, well, sir, you're in violation of the federal law, and I have the proof in your own reports. There really is no disputing any of this. you're going to have to clean up your pollution, and you're going to have to pay a big penalty, which will either go to the government or you can go to cleaning up the river, and you'll have to pay my attorney's fees because that's the way the law works, And you could say he was steaming. So
just quickly, how were you feeling? Like, were you actually quite nervous, given that they could really literally just chop you up and throw you away? And in that environment, I mean, I don't mean to kind of overstate it, but they really could just get rid of you.
Seriously, no, that's for sure. You're a million miles from nowhere, and in this vast gated compound.
In a compound that's dedicated to making pigs disappear. Yeah.
The thought crossed my mind, and, but I had the law on my side, and there I was in my little pinstripe suit, this was it was one of those, what do you call them? The blue and white stripe, because it was a hot summer day, come down from New York. And the fact that I was come down from New York with a New York accent also
did you feel a sense of confidence that you were going to win this? Because you had the
Absolutely.
data, that you had the law.
Yeah.
So did you have this quiet calm of like...
Absolutely. And I'd been winning these cases because, I lined them up. I had the data, I had the law, and I was winning every one of these cases. And indeed, I won every one of those cases. And I went up to 100.
And I mean, he's staring down the barrel of someone pointing a multi-million-dollar lawsuit at him. And did his blood boil right there in the minute? Right there on the spot?
Well, he was pretty unhappy. And then he turned to his lawyer, and Mr. Crook. And Woody Crook turned out to be a very good lawyer, because Mr. Luder said to Mr. Crook, well, Woody, you've heard what he has to say. What should I do? And Woody Crook rocked a little bit in his chair, and he said, well, you can pay him now, or you can pay him later. And if you pay him later, it's going to cost you a lot more.
Oh my.
But this was, so what that meant is settle with the guy now, because he's got, Woody Crook had read the letter. I mean, he knew the deal.
He knew that it was checkmate.
So, but Mr. Luder wanted to stay in court, and so we went to court, and
he paid more.
And he paid a lot more. It was a trial, and it was a good trial, and it was my first real trial. And then I went up all the way to the Supreme Court on this because he just wouldn't give up. He lost, and then he lost, and then in the Supreme Court he lost, and so he wound up paying more. And instead of having the money go to clean up the river, it went to the federal government, because he took it all the way up through the Supreme Court. So it was the biggest penalty a citizen had ever gotten at that point, and it really shocked other companies who had been told by the Reagan administration they could get away with it.
Yeah, this would have been big news in Slaughterhouse Magazine.
Well, yes, and
this would have sent a shockwave through the whole industry that this big lawsuit had been lost. And then what are they all? I mean, did you ever see the impact across all the other businesses, whether they suddenly took heed of the warning and the ongoing impact of this?
Well, yes, actually. So what I wound up doing is I wound up bringing around 100 cases, and we either settled or won all of those cases. And after a little while,
sorry, one sec. We settled and won 100 cases. I mean, I love how that rolls off the tongue and how casual you are about that. But that is literally, and for anyone listening, that is literally environmental devastation avoided on a scale that the human mind can't even comprehend. The thing that I completely, get inspired by with this is the sheer scale and impact of the work that you do. That you bring a pile of paper to the fight, and then your paper beats their pile of paper, and then suddenly millions of tons worth of this pollution gets stopped. And it ends. It's done, and then we can begin the cleanup.
Well, it's great, isn't it? And so I took all of those lessons, and I did it with so many of these companies in the United States. And then I brought this kind of the intellectual DNA of this type of work to Europe, where nobody was doing this work. And 13 years ago, started Client Earth, and and then
Before we get to Client Earth,
oh yeah, go ahead.
I've got another despicable story that,
Okay, sure.
that blew my mind. I loved how in the book I love how Looter the Polluter gets done, and it could have been. I mean, it could literally be it could be fiction. It would be a great movie. And just reading it in that book, you kind of get sucked right into the story, and I could imagine it being a great movie. The second one that kind of almost, it almost just wrenched the heart out of my chest was the 1,000-year-old trees in Alaska. And we're sitting there looking at, these trees that are massive giants that have taken 1,000 years to establish themselves. They're unlike anything else in the world. These trees feed on the nutrient of salmon and bears, and you describe this environment, this pristine, incredible environment.
Mm-hmm.
And then the government issues a contract for companies to log this stuff and to cut down these 1,000-year-old trees. And then when they do start cutting these trees down, they realize that there's not a lot of profit in it, so they're just going to pulp them. They're literally going to cut down 1,000-year-old trees and pulp them. And recently we've had people tearing down statues, like weird statues of people from the last several hundred years, and people are up in arms because the statue falls down, and it's like, oh my goodness, and a huge debate. And it's like no one's saying anything. These 1,000-year-old statues to history, these trees are falling and being pulped. And then suddenly the only person standing in the way of these 1,000-year-old trees going to pulp is you and your firm. And that to me was like, I was on the edge of my seat thinking, oh, please let this story end well.
Well, these stories can end well. And, we had a repeat of that essentially in Europe. So in Poland, there is this vast forest called the Białowieża, which is the last great mixed forest in Europe. And it has the same qualities as that Alaska forest of being ancient. This hasn't been disturbed for 10,000 years. Since the glaciers were retreated, this forest has been there. And the scientists say that every species of bird that was there 10,000 years ago is still there. And you have forest bison who live in the forest. They would have gone extinct except for being in this forest, and on, lynx, lots of different types of everything, including 3 species of eagles. And anyway, wonderful. And they, like the right-wing government in America that was cutting those trees, right-wing government gets in Poland and starts illegally cutting these 1,000-year-old trees. It's exactly the same story. I don't know what it is with right-wing guys who like to cut trees, but it's a thing. So we used the law, and it's a success. We got them to stop, and you'll have to keep doing that. And
just for the completion of the story in Alaska, it was yourself and one of your donors. You had this donor, this philanthropist who backed the lawsuit and saved it. And the point that you made, which kind of was really powerful, is that this philanthropist could have spent millions or tens of millions trying to buy up forest, and maybe would have been able to buy up a postage stamp size compared to what he saved through a lawsuit. So with a couple of $100,000, he was able to completely save like 1 million acres or some astronomical number. And it was for a 6-figure sum as opposed to an incomprehensible sum to try and buy up that forest. And just the impact of that. It's also terrifying to think that literally this stuff hangs in the balance, and we literally have yourself and your team as one of the, there's not a lot of environmental lawyers out there doing what you do.
Well, yeah. So so that one was in the U.S., and there's this tradition really comes from the U.S. and starting in 1970, and that donor was a particularly smart entrepreneur called Michael McIntosh, and who died a few years ago. But he did see that for him it was an investment. He said he was always looking for leverage, and he said, I can get more leverage out of the right lawsuit than out of buying the land. And he was right.
He's absolutely right.
And no, there aren't that many in the world. There are some in America, lawyers doing this, because this was invented there, and I did it there. When I came to Europe, there was nobody doing it in Europe. And then around the world, there are not that many,
So there's tens of thousands of lobbyists who are lobbying to cut stuff down and to exploit nature. And I kind of get this. I know you don't look like Batman, but you're kind of like Batman. You literally show up as this vigilante lawyer who is the last line of defense. You've got 200 lawyers on your team, don't you?
Well, 200 people, and about maybe 130 of them or so are lawyers. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yep. Yeah. And what's the culture like? What's the vibe like? You've started this from scratch, from a virtual address on the Strand, and now built it into a formidable law firm.
Well, I needed a really good address to start, so I rented a postal box on the Strand because I was meeting with people who had really nice addresses. So I looked around for mailboxes, etc., with a really good address.
By the way, I did the same when I first arrived to the UK in London. I got a virtual address right next to Buckingham Palace.
There you go. Well, we think similarly. Well, and people would say, gee, you're just starting out. You've just moved to the UK and you're just starting out and you have an office on the Strand. And I would say, well, it's actually an extremely small office. Of course, it was 6 inches by 6 inches.
Yeah, it's just a modest a shoebox, really.
Yeah, exactly. There you go. And then it grew very rapidly because the need is there. So we're 13 years in, we're 200 people. And offices in London and Brussels and Berlin and Warsaw and Beijing. And people on the ground in 5 African countries. But that's because this need was there, and there weren't people servicing the need. And you have lots of environmentalists who are extremely good campaigners, extremely good at policy, but they have tremendously more power when you combine that with law.
Well, the thing that comes across in the book is that even if the right policy gets enacted, unless it's tried, unless it goes to court, unless it's used, you kind of describe it in a very Darwinian way that laws die out, and that they, if they don't kind of get the pressure to evolve and to be tested, they just get discarded. So it's really, someone who's a layperson might hear a news story that there's been a new law passed for clean air, and it doesn't mean anything. It literally doesn't, unless there's someone prosecuting an offender. It doesn't mean anything.
Well, it often doesn't. I mean, and so air is a good example. So when I was starting up in the UK and across the rest of the EU, since no one had brought these kinds of cases, they were new in Europe, and I had to find an example where I thought it was a really serious problem and where we had a good chance of winning because we had this tiny, tiny team. And if you don't win your first battle, you may not stay in the game. So, and every entrepreneur knows that, and this was a very entrepreneurial situation. I had to find something. I thought the problem was very genuine and we might win. So the problem is really genuine with clean air, in Europe. Something like 400,000 people a year die early of air pollution. It's a very genuine problem. And so I brought a case in the UK and we wound up winning. But it was exactly what you're saying, that the law wasn't being enforced anywhere in Europe. So here you had the UK violating, but all the big cities across Europe were in this situation, a lot of small ones. Nobody was paying much attention. The air was far, far dirtier.
So the laws had been passed, the standards had been set, but no one was actually enforcing this stuff.
Well, that's right. I think, someone described it nicely by saying, the politicians, all the countries went to Brussels, including the UK, and they all wrote a nice law. It's quite a nice law. And they all took credit for it, patted themselves on the back, and citizens said, oh, great, now there's a law. And everyone said, great, and then nobody did anything about it. And that happens a lot, but not when citizens can come into court and haul the government in and say, you're not complying.
You've taken the government to court several times.
Yeah, well, in the UK on air quality 3 times and beat them 3 times. They stood up, actually. When I came to the EU,
it's so cool, by the way. I know for you, this is just your wheelhouse. You do this like day in, day out, but it's so cool to take the government to court and win 3 times.
Well, that's right. It is. Well, and it really is. And particularly when you win in the Supreme Court, you take them to the Supreme Court and you win. And it was the first environmental injunction ever from the UK Supreme Court.
I can imagine it's as thrilling as winning a sporting event or something like that. Like you must be absolutely elated when that final result, because it can be 3 or 4 years. It's like an Olympics, really. If you think about an Olympic athlete who trains for 4 years and then bang, you get that result. And it must be just exhilarating when that happens.
There's a lot of adrenaline, that's for sure. It's pretty exhilarating. But it was another case where here you had the government. I mean, we were talking about Mr. Luter, but the government wasn't a whole hell of a lot better. So we're in court, and the government barrister stands up and says, but now it's 2015, we're in the Supreme Court of the UK. And 2010, they had to comply with the law. They didn't. And they said to the Supreme Court, we have no intention of complying with this law for another 10 or 15 years. Meanwhile, 40,000 people in the UK alone were dying early of air pollution every year. 40,000. That's wow. 10 or 15 years is a lot of extra citizens going down. Yeah. And anyway, and they said, we have no intention of complying with the law for 10 or 15 years because it's not convenient. That
was their case.
Yeah. And then here comes their case. And the barrister wagged her finger at the Supreme Court and said, and you may not order us to comply to the Supreme Court. So one of the judges on the Supreme Court, who is a very smart judge and really gets it, said to us, well, you've heard what the government has to say. What do you expect us to do? We're only the Supreme Court. Wonderful question, right? So we could say, well, forget that it's environmental law. It could be family law or military law or securities law, whatever. If the government can come in and say to the Supreme Court, you can't order us to comply with the law, we're going to do it or not, then it's no longer a government under the rule of law. It's a government by fiat and diktat. And that's kind of what we said at the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court said, well, now that you've put it that way, and they gave us the injunction, they ruled for us there. And the government slowly is complying. And that's why we had to go back to court twice.
So do we, I live in London, do we breathe cleaner air as a result of that case?
Yes, to some degree, and you will throughout all of the UK. So it's taken some years, and they're going slowly, which is why we have had to go back to court. But air throughout the UK will be much cleaner as a result, and through Europe. We've now had cases in, I think it's 20 countries, and we win them all because it's so clear.
It's so incredible. Like when I'm reading the book and I'm hearing tens of thousands of people working against you to try and avoid these laws, and then you guys come in with a small team and you just kind of break them, and it is wild. It's just amazing stuff. Tell me the return on investment. Let's just quickly cover that. No, I just want to, if someone spends I don't know whether you feel comfortable talking about what your budgets are or how much you spend on legal in order to get what kind of return on investment. Have you ever calculated the ROI?
Well, yes, of course, and it depends on what sort of thing. But an example would be one of the things that we started right at the beginning in Europe was to try and prevent any new coal-fired power stations from being built. Because, if you want to stop climate change, stop coal. Really simple. Got to start there. Really simple. And there were, quite a lot, maybe 40 some that were about to be built in the EU. So we started an office in Poland, and no more have been built in Poland. We stopped 30 in Poland.
Wow.
And I just was looking at the numbers on that. And each of these coal-fired power stations is, they are often well over $1 billion in investment, right? So that's, say, 30 billion in investment, and that would have been in these 30 coal-fired power stations. We stopped every one of them for an average of around $250,000 each. So
wow, so
that's a pretty good return. Yeah.
So for millions, another way of thinking about that would be the redirection. You've redirected that spend into cleaner energy. There's, obviously right. they need the energy, so they're going to go and get it in a cleaner way that complies with the law.
Yes. Well, and yes, exactly. But we've redirected tens of billions for a few million. And there were 7 billion in subsidies that was going to go into these things from the EU, which we stopped.
Taxpayer subsidies were going. So taxpayers were going to literally pay to accelerate climate change.
Yeah, that was the game, and they were going to pay double even. That's because they were going to pay to build the things, and then they were going to give free allowances.
And presumably, to then in 5 to 10 years' time, to then pull them down. because they are breaking the law. So,
well, and also they're just, so our most recent case there, which was very cool. It was the first time we brought, and then I'll get back to another example of ROI, but we just brought a very cool case, which nobody else in the world has done, against a coal-fired power station, against a company that wanted to build one, a big energy company, part owned by the government. And the government was calling it, the Polish government, the last new coal-fired power station in Europe, which I think was a kind of a backhanded compliment to the fact that we prevent these things from getting built. But we thought, let's try a new way. So, because the great news about, again, for your group of investors, it's really, really important news. It's been a big change in just recent years, that economics is now on the side of the green. It wasn't 15, 20 years ago. When I brought the case for Luder, back then economics wasn't on the side of green stuff. It now is, particularly with energy.
Yeah.
So we got an independent economic analysis done for this plant. We took it to the company. It showed that this was going to be a stranded asset. This was not going to make money. It was a bad investment. Great. They said they're going to go ahead anyway. We bought shares. And then what did we do? We sued the officers and directors personally, saying that they were violating their duty to us as shareholders. This was not an environmental case, pure company law case. You have a duty to invest our money well. We spent 30 euros on shares in this company, and you're going to reduce the value of our investment by investing in a coal plant.
Investing in something that's a subpar investment.
Yeah,
what a cool way.
It was a good idea, right? Yeah.
You guys are so creative in the way that you do this.
Yeah, well, we have some really smart, this was a young, very smart lawyer who came up with this idea. Now we hired the best securities litigator in Poland, who brought the case. And in the right-wing papers, they didn't say crazy environmentalists sue company. They said investors question coal.
Ooh, beautiful.
And then what happens? We go to court, we win.
Now you're talking the language of the, of the people that you really need to bring around.
Exactly. Yeah, precisely. Because the whole idea is to move the money in the right direction towards clean everything. And this was a great way to do it. So we go to court, we win, and the punchline is the next day, the share price goes up 4%. The market was on our side, and that was the beautiful thing, and quite unexpected.
That is one of those real win-win scenarios. That is so elegant in all angles. I love that. Hey, let's jump a little bit off this topic. I want to talk about you personally. Like, how did you get into this? Like this environmental lawyer, kind of. How did you become? I mean, I know a bit of this from reading the book, but how did you become this lawyer who's suing governments and suing the biggest companies in the world and kind of changing the world in all these ways?
Well, it's a wonderful question. Can I just give you one more ROI example?
Yeah, let's talk.
So this was interesting. So I was meeting with Jeremy Grantham, who's an American investor. He's one of the big investors in America and totally into climate change. He's also a generous philanthropist. And a billionaire investor. And we're having a conversation about agriculture. And I wanted to start an agriculture program to shift 60 billion euros a year every year. The EU spends 60 billion on agriculture. And it now pushes agriculture in the wrong direction. Brown agriculture, industrial agriculture, all that. So I saw an opportunity to move it because the common agricultural policy is being rewritten into green. So it goes from bad subsidy to good investment if you can do this. So Jeremy Grantham,
60 billion.
60 billion every year. It's the biggest item in the EU budget, right? And it goes to exactly the wrong things, to encouraging people like Mr. Luder, essentially, is one of the deals, right? Crazy. Anyway, so I say to Jeremy Grantham, who's a super smart investor, I think there's a significant chance of moving the 60 billion a year from a bad subsidy to a good investment in a cleaner society. And he says, yes, I completely get it. That's 60 billion a year. How much do you need to start? And I said, it'll cost 500,000 a year, and we can do that. And he said, I have never been offered that kind of leverage. I'll give you half of what you need.
I mean, that is awesome. That is like, it is just, it's incomprehensible. In the investing world, it's asymmetric risk. It's, and it doesn't get any more asymmetric than that.
Oh, that's right. And that's is so attractive, and you just need to find your way in. So how did I start doing this? Well, I was very interested in being a biologist. I love, like any environmentalist, and any kid in the world loves nature, right? And you sort of move away from that as you grow up. But I didn't, and I was thinking of becoming a biologist, and then I realized that I would study and watch everything I loved decline once it became clear that would happen. And my father
basically have a front row seat of managed decline into oblivion, unfortunately, in that role, wouldn't you?
Well, that was, you could have spend a mournful career,
Yeah.
So and it happened that my father was a law professor, so I thought, well, I'll become a lawyer. There wasn't really any environmental law. This was a long time ago. So I thought, well, I'll do something with this. I don't know what. And then I go to law school, and the environmental law starts, and I'm one of the first people in doing this in the US, and help build that whole system there, and learn as I go as a young kid. And for a little while I was at a corporate law firm, didn't like it. And I was rescued by going to this place, NRDC, where I did these cases like we were describing earlier. And they said to me, we're looking to see if citizens can really make a difference when the federal government stops enforcing the law. We have enough for you, an assistant, and one scientist to work with you. Why don't you see if you can do what the Justice Department used to do, enforcing the law? And that's how we got to this case against Luder and all these other people. So what a fantastic, amazing entrepreneurial activity for a kid.
It is. I mean, when you tell it like that, it almost sounds, and even the similar time frame, it almost sounds like the Steve Jobs of law, like, that kind of, Steve Jobs at that time was creating with a tiny little group of rebels, creating something that took on IBM. And, and you were basically using the law in a completely brand new, innovative way with a small group of rebels, going up against a huge behemoth and winning.
And winning. That's what keeps you going too. And then when I came to Europe, I thought, well, no, I bet this would work in Europe. And then it has worked in Europe. And now the next big thing is, we were talking about coal. Coal is still a problem. Nobody should be investing in coal. But in Asia, people want to build over 400 new coal-fired power stations. If we do that,
we're toast, right?
Civilization is not in good shape yet. So I want to take these techniques and transplant them to Asia. And that's the next big play. And here's what I love. I love the fact that I've never come across a solution. In fact, I've felt so helpless in the environment. See, I know a lot of people, they see animals in distress, they see kids in distress or people in distress, and it's so natural and so normal to immediately emotionally connect with that. And one of the things that for me feels tragic is that the human brain doesn't seem to connect the same dots when the environment is in distress. And I've felt really helpless and thought, how am I going to look my kids in the eye when the time comes and they say, well, what were you doing? And it's not just climate change, it's also just even in our daily walk, there's plastic everywhere. Like there's these new masks and these gloves everywhere, the PPE equipment's everywhere. And it's like, I sit there and I think, well, one of my answers to the question of how can I look my kids in the eye was, well, there was nothing we could do. Like it was just such a big problem that there was nothing to be done. And then when I read your book, I thought, well, wait a second, there's nothing that can be done. The whole world operates on laws. And it's like the floodlights came on and I saw, oh, wow, stopping 400 coal plants is just 400 lawsuits. That can be done. That can totally be done. And it's like, here's the firm. Here's the answer. This is the answer to what we need to have happen. Well, thank you. Yeah.
No pressure. Speaking of civilization.
Well, no, but with help from people like you, it all becomes possible. Because it's for people like you who see it, then we work together and this becomes eminently possible.
So do you have hope for the future?
Tremendous hope for the future.
Like, because you're so close to this, you are so close to, I mean, in your private thoughts, in your private reservations, do you sometimes think, this is all too much, or are you got hope for the future?
I've got a lot of hope for the future, truly. I mean, the way it occurred to me recently to say it was, the reason is that because I absolutely know that environmental problems are mental problems. They're mental problems. It's the problems of how we think. And we can, every entrepreneur knows very well that there's a certain way of thinking that is a new way of thinking, right? And that's all you have to do. So we just have to change.
And examples in the entrepreneurial space is that, you think to yourself, how on earth will we remove all the plastic in the music industry with all these millions and millions of CDs? Oh, Spotify doesn't need any plastic. We're just going to boom in a stroke of some code. 5 years later, there are no CDs and everything's digital, and all of that tons and tons of plastic is just immediately removed. So adjacent thinking, different thinking can completely disrupt things, and it can happen so quick. The thing that kind of strikes me with your work is that humanity is actually sitting on top of a system of laws. And if you change those laws, you even gave an example in the book where you just said, look how quickly we stop smoking in restaurants. And it's now unthinkable that you would ever smoke in a restaurant. Like it's the weirdest idea. If someone lit up a cigarette next to you in a restaurant, it would just be like, what on earth are you doing? And yet it wasn't that long ago that was totally normal. And then they changed the laws and now it's unthinkable. And that's how quick it can happen.
I think so. And, and kids are helping a lot with this. I mean, kids aren't taking it anymore. And they're telling their parents plastic is really bad, and it's terrible stuff. Don't use it. And then we're working on changing those laws, and then we're working on closing down the plants that produce the plastics. So
can I just go? I wasn't going to ask you about this because this is a pet hate of mine, and I feel like I'm just asking you a question that's very selfish. But I get really peeved by over packaging. I sit there and I look at like in lockdown, you've had to order so many things online. You've had to order Amazon. The other day we ordered some batteries or something like that. And it literally a packet of batteries arrived in a bubble wrap thing with a box that was massively oversized. And when I unpacked it all, there was all this plastic for a packet of batteries, and it just made me want to scream. And I thought there should be a law against overpackaging. Bezos has got 100 billion in the bank. Surely he could use some of this to figure out how to send a packet of batteries through the mail a little bit easier.
Yes.
Is it possible that we could tackle something like that through what you do?
It is. I mean, there were a series of 5 laws that came out of Brussels for Europe that had to do with plastics, which were a pretty good start. Now, like all these laws, they need to be enforced and they need to get better. But this is one of the main. It's a correct pet peeve. I mean, I feel the same way. Every time I order something, and every time I go to the supermarket, I want 4 pairs. 4 pairs come with plastic on top.
Exactly. Even bananas, they wrap bananas. It's like bananas have their own packaging. It's very simple, easy packaging. It's brilliant packaging. It's packaging that tells you whether the product is ripe or not. I mean, it's, why on earth are we doing that? And then you buy a packet of biscuits and it's like you're buying some nuclear material or something. It's like you've got a plastic on the outside, then cardboard, and then you open the cardboard and they've decided to put them in a plastic tray with plastic wrapping around the biscuits as well. You think, what on earth are we doing? Are we insane?
Yes, is the answer. We are insane. And that goes back to the mental problem, right? So it's a mental problem. And part of it is that also you have people driving. So we all haven't been driving things in the right direction enough. These laws are a start in Brussels, and we'll work on enforcing them. And then we've already sued one plastics company that's trying to expand, Ineos. There's the biggest single-use plastics manufacturer, I believe, in Europe. And they're pushing for more single-use plastics, which is why you see more and more in packaging, because the fossil fuel industry, so oil and gas,
it's got to come up with new revenue streams.
Yeah, precisely so. So what they see, what their consultants say is more plastic is our plan B.
Oh, fantastic!
Yeah. So they're looking to build more plastics manufacturing facilities. That's what they're up to, and we're going to sue all of them in Europe. And this is going to slow them down. At least I hope.
Can I ask you a strange question? You seem to go up against some pretty bad dudes, some people who really don't care about the planet, 1,000-year-old trees, endangered species. I mean, you get right under their skin, and they can't believe that you would have the audacity to stop them chopping down a 10,000-year-old forest. Have you ever actually been threatened, like physically threatened, by these bad dudes?
I haven't, no. The head of our office in Warsaw did get death threats when we brought. We started by bringing 14 cases against, billion-euro power plants, and this was, he had a phone. He had two phones. The one I had the number. The second phone was a second phone, and only his mother, brother, and wife had the number. I didn't have it. And that's the phone that the death threats came on,
Wow.
indicating we know how to get.
We are so close to you.
Yeah, the sounds of AK-47s, and I asked him, but Poles are very tough. So I said, "Is this upsetting?" And he said, "Somewhat." I said, "How?" Yeah, I said, "How upsetting?" He said, "Well, somewhat upsetting."
It's a 4 out of 10.
Yeah, that if they were really serious, they would have broken my legs.
I'm not afraid of emojis. Wow, what that? I mean, that's pretty tough. That's
pretty tough.
Those Polish are pretty tough.
I have endless admiration for this guy.
What a crusader! People don't understand when I joke around and say you guys are like Batman and you guys are like Steve Jobs and you guys are like, people don't actually get it, that the work that you're doing is every bit as exhilarating and risky and transformational. Like it's off the scale beyond what the human mind can even comprehend, the types of work that you guys are doing. You're also a Zen Buddhist. You're into Zen and meditation and the power of intention. You've met the Dalai Lama.
Yep.
Tell us a bit about that aspect of your life.
Well, very important to me. So it's always been very important to me. When I was very young, my mom was a devout Catholic, so the idea of having a spiritual life was always with me. And then there was a certain point in my life that life didn't make sense, and I found myself, when I was a young litigator, actually bringing a lot of those cases. One morning I found myself staring into 3 o'clock in the morning, into the bathroom mirror, reciting, I'm James Thornton, I'm 35 and a lawyer. I'm James Thornton, 35 and a lawyer. And I said to myself, oh, this is a really interesting thing this is like my name, rank, and serial number, and I must be overstressed. What am I going to do about it? And how am I going to understand the meaning of my life? Because I'm not actually, much as my work is valuable, it obviously isn't getting me to the deeper place I need to be if this is what I'm doing at 3:30 in the morning in the bathroom mirror. And so I thought about it, and Zen seemed like my only serious opportunity to really answer the question of why am I here. So I read books. I started meditating at home. I just loved it, and then I went and met this wonderful Japanese Zen master in California. Moved from New York to California, founded an office in California so I could be near him, and then worked with him for 10 years until he died, and then many years later became ordained. So I'm actually a Zen priest. And
oh, wow.
It's incredibly important in that it centers me and it puts me in touch with my deep intention.
And would you say this is one of the practices that has been able to allow you to keep centered in the face of humongous challenge?
Absolutely. Yeah, because you connect with a much deeper purpose, and the ego gets out of the way. There's a very and the other thing that happens is that you get access to your own creative impulses. So your intuition, which you need in business or in law, if you're really going to have creative solutions, you get a very much more natural access to your creative intuition, to creative problem solving. Can I mention something? I want to connect the dots there with the entrepreneur world, because I often get asked the question, what makes a successful entrepreneur? And my best answer is around the fact that they're visionary. And I say that there's kind of my personal experience of being an entrepreneur is that I tend to be in one of three modes. The worst case is that I'm in reptile mode, which is having fight, flight, freeze
drafting scathing emails or texts at someone who's wronged me, or something like that, or locking horns with someone who I feel the need to lock horns with. And I always regret that, and I never come up with anything productive from that mindset. Then there's the tinkerer, the kind of monkey brain tinkering away, doing emails, tinkering, not really changing the world or transforming things. And then there's the visionary, which is being on purpose, being big picture, visiting the future, having a look around, seeing what's there, thinking about what parts I can start creating today, and that visionary mind. And often I've said to our entrepreneurs that probably the most powerful thing you can do is find ways to reconnect more often with the visionary, and get into that inspired, purposeful higher mind, and actually all the techniques, all the strategies, all the stuff that you see working is more of a product of that than it is that you can try and copy the technique. It won't work for you. But the one thing that does work is visiting, that visionary space in your mind or in your soul. So is that what you found as well?
Absolutely. You said it very nicely. And then if you want to enter that visionary space, what's the key to open the door? And for me, the meditation is the Zen way.
How often do you meditate?
Oh, it's certainly every day.
A daily practice.
A daily practice, yeah. And because it keeps you centered, and then when you want to have access, it's much easier. And then you can access it during the day. So if you're working on a problem, for example, you're saying, how do I get into this market? Here's the information I know. Here are the costs. Here's what I want to do. Here are the barriers. I almost see it. I don't quite get it. I've got this rational analysis. It doesn't all quite fit together. Then you go into the space and you just hang out in the space and you hold the information. And very often, and sometimes takes a long time, then a solution emerges, and it emerges from having the information, having processed it, rationally, then holding it, with the question, hold the question. And then I find you get there. And I often solve problems that way.
One of the things that I find about a spiritual practice is that there tends to be some people who go off onto a spiritual practice and they're so into the spiritual practice without very much practical application. They're not fighting any battles. They're not fighting any wars. And I've said to a few of my friends, it's very easy to be spiritual sitting next to a waterfall with no problems around. Try doing it with, 3 screaming kids under the age of 6 or something like that. Or try doing it trying to sue the government. And then there are other people who go really down the going to war path, where they're trying to change the world, or they're trying to do something big. They're trying to achieve some massive thing without a spiritual practice. And then they often end up finding that it's actually quite fruitless, or it just doesn't it doesn't have a fulfillment to it. There's just something missing from even huge, massive success. And there's very few people I see, but it's remarkable when it happens, that have kind of got those two things where they've got a spiritual practice and they also go to war. And they go, when I say go to war, they go take on a big problem, a massive, challenging problem, without knowing how the hell it's going to resolve itself. And the two things hand in hand tend to be a formidable experience, a human experience, very human experience, that you actually get this chance to apply the spiritual principles in a very testing environment, and then to win and have it mean something. It's kind of, it seems like you walk that path.
Well, yes, and clearly you do too, because you can only describe it that way from the inside. So this is, and this is what makes it so much fun, right? Because you're always growing. I mean, you're always being challenged. And the spiritual practice gives you a place to allow yourself to be pulled and open more and more. There's a reason that the samurai warriors used to study Zen, because they would go into very tough situations, lose your head, and you wanted to be calm, and you wanted to get out of the way.
Yeah. And another way of saying that is that Zen practitioners were samurais. There's a reason that Zen practitioners picked up swords and went and fought battles. It's kind of like it's like the true meaning of finding this stuff is then what you go and do with it, and the ability to throw yourself into a horrendous situation and see if you can go and face the fire and do something with it.
Well, I find that plenty of fires come your way. You don't have to look for them.
It's almost like the calmer you are, the more centered you are, the world says, okay, cool, let's test that. Let's see. Okay, you didn't lose your shit with this. How about this? Yeah.
That's right. And then, of course, sometimes you do lose your shit.
Yeah.
And then you say, and then you forgive yourself and start all over again.
So when even with all the work that you've done, do you still find yourself having a reptile moment? What I would call a reptile moment.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Do you
when you want to just kill somebody and throttle them? Yes, of course.
Yeah.
Not infrequently. So what?
I'm so glad that you've said that.
Absolutely. Oh no, come on.
Do you ever draft absolutely savage emails to people where you just dissect them? One of the funny things that happened with me recently is that I drafted a response to there was a particular email that came into me, and it outlined this set of things that I was meant to respond to, and I just tore it apart, and I wrote this massive response, and point by point, bang, 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 and I had fortunately the good sense to just sleep on it, and I thought, I'm not going to send that till tomorrow afternoon. So I went back and I reread it, and I replaced it all with 2 lines saying, I think you're absolutely right. Right? I'm not going to argue with any of what you've said, but here's what I think we should do in order to part ways amicably. And then there's one line, here's what I think would be the workable solution. And then came back a response with, yeah, I'll agree to that. And I got exactly the deal that I wanted, exactly the deal. And had I gone head first, reptile mode, had I sent that, just pushing send, there is no question in my mind, we'd still be debating, we'd still be fighting, we'd still be arguing over who was right and who was wrong, and I wouldn't have that solution, and I'd be stuck in the problem.
No, that's a beautiful story, and I think it illustrates well. So what the praxis does, and the stillness, even if you're not still, there's a bit of it sticks to you, right? And what it does is it gives you a little space around acting on the reptile mind. So what I've started doing is when I write one of those emails, I put it in my draft folder, just like you did. And then my
Evernote is full of the most toxic emails.
Okay, today I went in and I deleted a bunch of them just so that I didn't send them by accident.
Clear that energy out.
So it's important. It's important to do that.
It's great to know that you've still having the reptile moments that you actually, it's just not leveraging them.
Well, I think that's the key thing. So it gives you more space, and space is often what you need in those times, and to make a choice. And it's all about the choice, right? So there are times when you just have to get really angry with somebody. It's what the situation calls for. What you don't want to do is to get angry without, you get angry, but you don't want to necessarily unleash it.
Get angry as a strategy rather than as a reflex.
Precisely, yeah. You want to do it knowing that you think it's the right thing to do.
It's the right thing to do.
Rather than doing automatically, yeah. And sometimes it's the right thing to do.
Yeah, it'd be great to have a proper fight with the Zen priest. So you said you're hopeful for the future.
Yeah.
Do you have a vision for the future? Do you actually have a utopia that we're shooting for? Do you have when you think about a positive future that we could be working towards or moving towards, what are some of the ingredients that are in your mind about a world that works?
Yeah, well, so a lot of them are depend on good entrepreneurship. In fact, I was mentioning that I think economics are moving things in the right direction. Things become possible now. But in terms of transport, we need a completely new transport. Now, that's being done by big companies mostly now, but electric vehicles, which are self-driving and that are fueled by electricity that's generated in a green way. So, the future nice world is one where we've done the energy transition, and it's a zero carbon world. But there are a lot of other elements of it. So, so the energy system is different. Agriculture is very different. And one of the interesting things for me over the last year has been learning more about the new ways of making meat. So you have the Impossible Burger type,
Beyond Meat,
Beyond Meat, Impossible Burgers, and Just, which is another big company. So that's one, where you make the vegetarian substitute for meat, which is acceptable to a lot of meat eaters. And last time I was in California, I had my first Impossible Burger, and it was terrific, But then then there are a couple of other things. One is, and this is all done as you probably know, you do it in pharmaceutical grade laboratories, in bioreactors. So you're producing, pharmaceutical grade food.
Actual meat.
And that the second type is actual meat. Yeah. So and actual beef, actual pork, actual fish.
Yep.
I mean, bluefin tuna. People are working on. And so you'll be able to eat bluefin tuna without any bluefin tuna suffering. And the amazing thing about this, I mean, there are a number of amazing things about it. I mean, the knock-on effects for me help us get a lot towards the future we want to get to. Because once you've got 10 billion people eating meat, you lose more and more of the world's forests. The meat production itself is probably about 15% of the global emissions.
It's a huge part of the problem.
Huge. And it's the biggest, if you look at the Amazon rainforest, the biggest, we were talking about forests. Here's another ancient forest. It's being cut for beef production. Complete madness. So if this works as I hope it works, and you have the beef industry disrupted over the next 10 years, I mean, it looks to me like by 2030, beef industry will be disrupted. Then you can start to look at the Amazon as a place where the maximum, and the other forests, where the maximum threat is during the next 10 years. So it's not over the next 100 years, but if you reduce the threat by 70, 80%, it becomes much more containable.
If we can buy some time, we can actually get past that
yes,
real threat.
Yes. Well, and then so people wind up eating meat, and not everyone's going to become vegetarian, but it comes from a beautiful laboratory where you also are not putting in hormones and all kinds of nasty chemicals. So so that's a great thing. Another aspect of it is that looking into the future, even if we do, as I hope we do with these various activities of transport, energy change, agriculture change, in particular meat industry change,
and Amazon packaging.
And Amazon packaging, absolutely. No, the plastic has to go. I mean, the plastic just has to go.
Yeah.
We will have climate change to some degree, because some is already locked in the system. And I've started to worry about, what happens to the people on the equatorial belt of the world, who are already, not the world's rich people in general. It will get harder. It will be harder for them. I've started to think about migration and how do you reduce the need to migrate. One is through this new agriculture, because they'll also be able to produce in this very nice pharmaceutical grade way, maize flour, rice flour, wheat flour, and the exact stuff. And you'll be able to do it everywhere for very, very cheap once it all gets going. So that when it becomes harder to produce food because of a massive drought somewhere, people will have food, so it will alleviate some of the problems, some of the difficulties. So the future, I think, is one that we can co-create, in which you do have clean energy, you do have clean agriculture, you do have fish in the sea again, because you can make fish also in the laboratory.
And it is incredible how quickly ecosystems can bounce back. They only need 10, 20 years and they start to, I mean, life is formidable when it's given, when we don't mess with it. If we just step out of its way, it does actually have an amazing, there is some anti-fragility in the chain there that it comes back. Obviously, when you chop down 1,000-year-old tree, it doesn't come straight back, but 1,000 years in Earth time is also doable.
Oh, very much so. Yeah. So you put all of those things together, and then you start working on how to make communities more resilient to the climate change that will occur. And that becomes a joint enterprise of everybody when you take away the mental from the environmental problems, take away the mental problems. Once everything starts to become a green industry, everyone begins to see things differently, I think. And the people who don't get it don't matter anymore because coal is no longer an option.
The system. Yeah. A lot of the time, it's the system. If the system is fixed, then it doesn't matter whether there are people who don't get it.
That's exactly right.
And so, people change so quickly. People what is considered to be a normal thing, 1 year, 5 years later, if the law changes, people don't do it anymore. People change. People change very rapidly. And you see, hear that you're hopeful.
Well, very hopeful. And one of the things that actually made me very hopeful is working in China, because the Chinese world's biggest polluters, but human rights problems very real. But on environment, they're determined to clean up, and they're determined to be leaders in this way.
And in many ways, something that is considered a weakness can also be a strength, or something that's a threat can also be a strength. So an all-powerful totalitarian government that suddenly wants to be a clean environmental leader actually can orchestrate change very rapidly.
Very rapidly. And we've helped them do that. So we've been training judges for the last 5 years to decide environmental cases. The prosecutors then came to us and said, I helped write a law that gave prosecutors the right to sue the government on behalf of the people for the environment. And then the prosecutors came to us after we started training the judges, federal prosecutors in China, and said, we now have the right to sue the government on behalf of the people, like if they're not cleaning up the air in Yunnan province or something. But that's new for us. You sue governments all the time. Could you train us to sue the Chinese government?
Talk about being a bit counterculture. There's going to be some resistance.
Well, no, actually, because these are the federal prosecutors. So we trained them, and they've been bringing cases. And in the last 3 years, they've brought over 100,000 cases.
Wow!
They work at a big scale.
Are you saying that the domino effect of what you've created has led to 100,000 cases?
Well, they wanted to do this, but they didn't know how to do it. So,
but how does that feel? How does your brain absorb that information that you are genuinely one of the few people who's changing the world in that way?
Well, I see it as, I really don't see it as me. I'm a node in the network, and I contribute certain things, and I certainly didn't make them do this. I just potentiated what they wanted to do.
Facilitated them.
Yeah. So it's not me, it's everybody, and that's the cool thing, So if you think it's all you, then
then it's ego, right?
Well, then you get into a Donald Trump type of situation.
Yeah, I've always loved the idea that no matter how important you think you are always just a little piece on the tapestry, and you unthread one little piece in the tapestry, and the whole tapestry starts to unravel. And it's like, as soon as you start to think of yourself as separate from this tapestry, you begin to unravel what is the beauty of it.
Yes.
It's lovely to hear you say that. How can we help? How can we, so as a community of, Dent has 3,000 entrepreneurs, we're global, we've got people who passionately care about making an impact in the world, many of which are environmentalists. Yep. Many of our entrepreneurs absolutely adore leverage and solutions and all that sort of stuff. What could our clients and our community do to help you?
Well, a lot. I mean, one would be if they did want to, understanding the big leverage, if they wanted to contribute. I mean, we're a charity, so anything goes a very long way. Our annual budget for 200 people is only around 16 million a year, so it's incredibly small. We don't pay people like lawyers get paid. We pay people, as if they were in any environment.
So here's a wild idea. Like, a wild idea would be that some of our people put you guys on retainer and just have a law firm on retainer, even if it was £100 a month or a couple of £100 a month. And now it's like, you know what? I've got a law firm on retainer. I'm paying the retainer to a law firm to clean up the world. Wouldn't that be cool if you're an entrepreneur? If you're listening to this and you're thinking that you want to do something insanely cool, I've heard some of you say, and I know this is insanely cool, but I've heard some of you say, wouldn't it be great to have a Tesla for £2,000 a month, so that you're cleaning up the environment? I know that a Tesla is pretty cool, but this would also be pretty cool if you could put these guys on £100 a month retainer. That would work a treat.
It would be incredible, And I mean, it's a very exciting idea. Yeah.
Yeah, that would be cool. The other thing too, I've ordered 100 copies of Client Earth. The book is amazing. If you love John Grisham or kind of those legal thrilling books, it is a thrilling book full of mind-blowing stuff, case after case of stuff that kind of is exhilarating and fascinating in equal measure. So if you want a copy of Client Earth, feel free to contact Dent, info@dent.global, and you can have one of the 100 copies that I've bought. I'm also going to send some of those out to, a few of the people in my network who I really want to kind of force this idea upon, and see if I can, impact some change that way. I would really encourage you, if you really resonate, some people who listen to this will just be like on the edge of their seat thinking, what they could do. One of the fun things to really do if you discover something like this is to just buy 10, 15 copies of the book and just send them out to some of your more influential friends and just say, this is a great book, you should check this out. Because if you can put this in front of the right person and they bites them, the leverage on this is extraordinary. So
that's a beautiful idea, and a few people have done that, and it has brought us some really important friends. So it's a beautiful idea, and it works. I can guarantee it. Yeah.
Yeah. So thank you so much for taking the time to have a chat with our community. Our values at Dent are to be brave, to have fun, and to make a dent in the universe. So being brave is about being out of the comfort zone, challenging the status quo, doing things that are a bit different. And you obviously, you have that as a huge value. Having fun is playing with it and feeling the passion and the excitement and the the playfulness of it. And I love that about what you do as well. And then making a dent is that leverage, that impact, seeing a problem and saying, you know what, I might not be able to solve everything, but I can make a dent in the problem. I can do something. And often that actually leads to something much bigger than you originally first thought. And I think what we've found in you is someone who really just exhibits those three values that we try and encourage entrepreneurs to live by: be brave, have fun, make a dent. So thank you very much for being such a great example of that.
Well, thank you. And, I think if we all work together and as a community, there's no doubt you're asking about being positive. Together, we can for sure save civilization. So, and have fun doing it.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. A pleasure.